let's talk about how long fermentation should take. Welcome to the Fermentation. I'm Brian.
I'm Derica.
And today we're talking about fermenting and how long should it be? And I can answer this really quickly. It depends.
Yep.
That's the truth. That's the answer.
And we know that so many people really hate that answer.
I hate that answer myself. I hate giving that answer.
We get some pretty aggressive replies when we don't give you the magic bullet number, because I think so many people are just looking for that. And this is something that you need to take into consideration, and that's homebrewing is an art form. So
and a science.
There's so many different variables. There's so many different options, which really makes it a great hobby. But it also makes it very difficult to give you that specific number, because that number is dependent on all the other things going on.
Homebrewing is kind of like cooking and baking all in one. When it comes to baking, you have specific things that have to happen. There's chemical processes that have to actually occur, or the thing that you're trying to make doesn't come out as you expected it to come out. That's the science part of fermentation and homebrewing. And then you have the cooking part, which is that's where you can add your own little spin to things. You can flavor it the way you like it. You can add personal touches to things that don't actually affect the fermentation process, or they come after the fermentation process. One of the reasons why people always ask how long should fermentation take is because a lot of recipes are written after 5 days, rack it off. After 12 days, rack it off. I don't know where they get these numbers from, because that's not a good way to do things.
Nope.
The other thing is, we live in a society where we are used to things being timed and controlled and measured. But here's the problem. Yeast are living things. And when you put them into their own microbiome within your fermenter, even if it's right next to another fermenter, those are completely different microbiomes. Imagine it like this. We live in our own universe, right? Imagine if there was another universe right next to ours. Don't you think that things might be a little bit different there than they are in ours? Well, it's the same thing with fermentation fermenters. They're different universes each single time. They're a whole completely different ecosystem, even the same recipes, because slight differences in the fruit, slight differences in the honey, slight differences in the yeast, all those things can have a factor effect on the whole thing. And then if you say, oh, but I use the exact same fruit, the exact same honey, the exact same yeast. Yeah, but the yeast are multiple generational, meaning they're going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And every generation is going to evolve slightly differently than the last. So if you have two different ecosystems that are disconnected from each other, they're going to evolve separately, kind of like Madagascar and the rest of the world. Things evolved there differently than they did on many other places on the world. Same thing is happening. Okay.
All right.
Your turn.
Now that we've got that out, we are going to talk about some of the things that are going to affect the length of fermentation and how they do so. And we're going to start off with temperature, because this is probably one of the
most crucial and most
obvious,
misunderstood.
We said completely different things, but they're all true. And that's based on your brewing environment.
Right. Now, temperature is important because your yeast is going to have a range that it likes to work in. Just remember, the closer you get to either end of that range, the lowest and the highest, you're going to have less than ideal effects. Now, what I mean by that is they can produce esters, which sometimes you may want that, like Kveik yeast is known for producing pretty interesting esters when it's stressed, when it's pushed to its limits. And you also can have stalls if it goes to the lower side. So in general, most yeast really do like something like, I think it's 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way through to like 85 on a lot of them, is written that way on the packaging. Unfortunately, it's not on the packaging most of the time. You actually have to Google foo and look it up. I don't know why. I wish they would just put alcohol tolerance and the temperatures right on the packets, but they don't. So you just have to do a little Google foo and you can find it. But if, let's say it's 60 to 90, just for easy numbers, that means 75 is smack in the middle. That is probably, in my opinion, and this is just a theory of mine, the most ideal temperature for that yeast. Because as you go closer to 60 degrees, they're more likely to stall. And as you go closer to 90 degrees, they're more likely to stress and produce off flavors, fusels, weird esters, that sort of thing. Now, as an experiment, that could be fun to play with, but for actual reliability, sticking somewhere in the middle is probably your best bet.
Now, of course, that is a generalization, and generalizations in our experience are generally Inaccurate. So if you have a specific style that you're doing, like say a lager,
Right.
that's going to need a much cooler temperature. And
But the yeast like that too.
Right. There's plenty of wines that have a similar thing. So you have to do a little bit of research and make sure that you're creating the environment that's suitable for what you're brewing and what you're using to brew it with.
Now, temperature. Here's the generalization about temperature and fermentation time. The lower the temperature, generally speaking, the longer fermentation will take. And the more slowly it'll actually ferment, the less aggressive it'll ferment, which means less of your aromas and flavor is in the aroma coming out your airlock and being lost to the air outside that ecosystem. That's important. It's something to be aware of. Whereas the warmer you get, the faster it ferments, the more it can blow out those aromas, which is also flavors, going out your airlock into the ecosystem outside of your fermenter, which means once they're gone, they're lost forever. Now, I'm putting a little stress on that because this is something we don't really talk about in most of the shows when we're doing recipes. But a super aggressive fermentation is kind of not ideal. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's not ideal. You don't want something that's explosive and erupting all over the place. We joke about it and say, oh, that's just a happy yeast. It is happy yeast. But when anything comes out, that's not necessarily great because the more flavors and aromatics that come out, the less you have left in your brew.
I like to equate it to us as people. Let's say you're over caffeinated. You had a rough morning and you just
like
drank
me right now?
tons and tons and tons of caffeine. Okay, you're going to be super active. You're going to have lots of energy. You're going to be doing all things. But are you really going to do the best job you possibly can?
That's true.
Probably not. Whereas if you're just slow and steady, like the tortoise and the hare, that tortoise, he's going to keep on going. He's not going to make any mistakes, and he's going to get to the finish line. It's just going to be at his own pace.
So that's the gist, though. The higher temperature, faster, not necessarily better. Low temperature, slower, not necessarily better because it could stall. So that's where somewhere in the middle gives you the best of both worlds.
But Brian also prefaced all of this talk with generally.
Oh, yeah.
So there are some instances where the higher temperatures are really what you are going to strive for.
Kvike yeast is a perfect example.
That is a stressor, and that might actually bring more flavor to the table rather than less.
And then you have the opposite end, lagers, like it cold so that you can get a cleaner, crisper flavor that lagers are known for.
All right. I think that covers temperature.
I think we've covered temperature quite nicely.
All right. So that brings us to starting gravity.
Yeah. The gravity that you start with, how much fermentables you actually have, however you want to see it, that is going to be the biggest determining factor next to temperature for how fast it ferments. In other words, if you start with, half a pound of honey versus 4 pounds of honey, obviously the half pound's going to ferment a lot faster than 4 pounds would. And this is something that comes up a lot. People ask, oh, how long should it take? And they haven't told us anything. And even if you tell me how many pounds of honey you add, it doesn't mean I can tell you how long fermentation is going to take. I can give you a range. That's the best. And actually, I'll just give you an answer right now. How long should fermentation take if you're making a mead? Anywhere from a few days to a few months. And that's the honest answer. That is the best, most accurate answer I can actually give.
It is. And we can appreciate your frustration that is not the answer you're looking for, but that is an honest answer.
Yeah.
And again, all those other variables are going to affect that number.
Right. But this is not even a generality. This is a rule. The more sugars you add to ferment, the longer it's going to take to ferment out. Very, very simple. That came out very awkward out of my mouth, but I think you know what I mean. And when we say starting gravity, we mean just the starting fermentables that you add in. If you put in, 1 pound versus 3 pounds of sugar, honey, fruit, whatever, the higher number of poundage, the longer it's going to take for it to ferment out.
Now, there is a point of no return on that you can have so much fermentable product at the very beginning that your yeast just, nope.
Well, does that mean that if you put in too much, you can actually make a shorter fermentation time? Because it'll be stalled.
It'll be instantaneously.
It'll never take off. Therefore, it's the fastest fermentation ever. But it didn't even ferment, so that doesn't really count.
And this is another science thing, is that if you oversaturate your must or your whatever you're working with, and you introduce your yeast into that, their cells can actually rupture.
Yep.
Therefore, they're not going to be able to do anything.
It's an interesting thing. It kind of happens with a lot of things. It works through osmosis. What happens is they want to create equilibrium. So it happens with salt as well. Salt and sugar both do this. You have a more dense liquid on the outside of their cells, so their cell permeability sucks in that liquid, and they want to create an equilibrium. But at a certain point, too much sugar actually explodes their cells. I'm probably explaining it a little bit wrong, but that's the backwoods version, the simplified explanation. It is kind of that idea. So if you have too much sugars, you can kill your yeast. And this is where a lot of times, if somebody started way too high, even all the tricks that you can do to get a stall going again don't work because their yeast are dead. You have to add more yeast. But the problem is now you're adding yeast to an already stressed situation that's going to be difficult for them to start in. It just creates a mess. We actually did a podcast on stalls, and if you're curious about stalls, I suggest go listening to that one. We went pretty in depth into how to fix them.
I'll link that in the description below of this video or this podcast, so that way you can check it out if you want to.
Right.
And this is a great transition from that.
Oh, wait. I have something else to say.
Okay.
I've actually had people be very surprised when they made a low gravity like a low starting gravity, like a 1.030 or a 1.025 must, and it was done in like 2 days. And they're like, is this even possible? Well, yeah, it is totally possible because you didn't have much sugars for them to work on. So they're going to blow right through that and then be done very, very quickly. Just like I've had people say, I started this must at a very high gravity. I mean, higher than I would recommend. And after 3 months, it's still slightly going. It's still slightly moving along. And they say, is that possible? Well, yeah, of course it is, because the yeast are just barely nudging it down. They're just working through it. It takes longer the more sugars there are.
All right. So now we can transition.
Now we can transition to the next thing.
And the next thing is the fermentables. So we talked about how much of a fermentable. Now we're going to talk about the different types of fermentables and how those can also affect the length of fermentation.
Right. And it can be, see, there's so many variables here too, but let's take like straight sugar versus, say, honey. There's a little bit of a difference there. Yeast can actually ferment the sugar a little bit easier than the honey, but it's not that much different. But now let's take that to something like a fruit. If that fruit is not frozen, it's totally fresh and dropped in, well, it's going to take them longer to break down those cell walls to get to the sugars to be able to ferment them, so it's going to take a little bit longer. But if you froze that fruit first, then you put it in, as it thaws, those cell walls start to rupture and the yeast can get to it, so it'll be a little faster. How much? Well, depends on all the other factors. And that's why the answer is it depends. But it depends on depending things. So there's no straight answer to this question.
Beyond that, if you cook something or bochet a honey, which is a cooked honey for that can actually change the molecular structure of the fermentable sugars, and also in some cases make them no longer fermentable.
Right. And then there's even the further step, and that's starches, like things like bananas, or even like for beer. But say you have a malted barley. Well, now you need an enzyme to break down those starches in the grain into sugars that can actually be fermented, because yeast can't break down the starches. So that's something like people try to do potato wine. Even when we did our banana wine, we actually did it wrong. You have to actually introduce an enzyme to break the starches down into sugars. Now, bananas do have a little bit of sugar in them, but say potato, not so much. You need amylase to actually break that down to get the sugars out of the starch, because the starch is just a complex sugar. I don't like to say it that way, but that's kind of what it is. It's a different kind of carbohydrate than just straight sugar. Yeast can't break it down. They can't ferment it directly.
And that's why we used a specialized yeast when we did the rice wine.
Yep,
because
rice
we
wine is a
had
perfect
to
example. Yep.
have that extra thing to break down the rice.
Right. But even beyond just that, for your fermentable, you could have a fermentable that's more acidic. You could have one that's more alkaline. Those things are going to be, if they're at the extremes of what the yeast can handle, they're going to make it take longer or possibly even stall. And then there's preservatives. And before you say, oh, I don't put anything with preservatives. Well, if you use pears, you just added a preservative, can inhibit fermentation slightly. And there's lots of those kind of things in lots of different fruits, and everything is just a little bit different. And that's what makes homebrewing fascinating and frustrating at the exact same time.
All right. Without deep diving into molecular structure of different fermentable sugars,
I wasn't planning to do that.
We're gonna-
That's a little beyond what we're doing here.
we're going to move forth to yeast selection.
Okay, here's another one. Your yeast selection has a wide range of variables applied to it already. First, you have the pH range that they can work in. Then you have the temperature range that they like to work in. And then you also have the alcohol tolerance. Now, alcohol tolerance is probably the most usable of those numbers right off the bat, because if you have a yeast that's only good to say 10% and you have a must that can go to 15, you already know you messed up. It's just not going to ferment that all. And vice versa. If you have a yeast that can go to 15% and you have a must that can go to 10%, well, you're good. It should go dry. It should ferment out and shouldn't have problems. That's what I'm getting at. It should not have problems and should be more quick to ferment than the opposite way around.
Right. Saying that you messed up, that's not really the right term. But if you're expecting it to go dry, then you know you're not going to, because you're surpassed the ability of that particular yeast strain.
But you could be trying to overshoot the yeast and keep some sugars. So yeah, it's not really
overshooting. When we first started brewing, that's our method of what we did.
More.
And we're going to do it more. But there is a range where you can retain sweetness without stressing the yeast. And so if you go too far, you're probably going to stress your yeast. And that's what
we talked about that earlier.
mentioned.
If you're too high, you're going to kill your yeast off.
Yep.
Whereas you got to find like that sweet spot where you're just a little past what the yeast can probably handle, leaving a little bit of sweetness in the brew. And that's a fine line, and it's actually much more difficult than just letting it go dry and back sweetening.
Right, because as we say time and time again, yeast can't read.
Yeah, they don't know what it says.
You might magically make a really comfy environment for your yeast, and they'll just say, alcohol tolerance? I can't read. I don't know what that means. And they'll just keep on brewing to their little heart's content.
Or they'll just decide they don't want to.
Yep.
That happens too. Generally speaking, they stick to within 1 or 2% of the alcohol tolerance. Most yeast do. At least most yeast do. US04 we found can go to 13 and 14, even though it's marked for 10 or 11, I think. And 71B is marked for, I think, 13. And we've had that go to 17. So they don't always listen. We've also had like EC 1118 crap out at 12 and 13. So you never know, but it's always good to have an idea. And this is kind of part of just being prepared, having an idea of why this could happen, why that could happen, and what it is. Whenever we have a stall, whenever something doesn't go exactly the way we want it to, we're always like, okay, let's go back and figure out what we did different. What could this be? And usually we can figure something out and go, yep, well, there's what it is. Duh, didn't see that at the time, but that's what it was. Another thing about yeast that could affect fermentation time in a very minor way is how much you add in the beginning. Now, we have played around with this a lot. Generally speaking, I say use half a packet up to 3 gallons and a full packet past 3 gallons. But for a while, we were doing a whole packet in even 1 gallon batches. Here's what we found. It started up faster. And when I say faster, instead of taking 6 hours on average for our things to start up, they start up in like 3 or 4. Now, please, 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 nobody freak out if your brew has not started in a day or 2 days. After 3 days, that's when you can start being a little concerned and do something about it. But it can take up to about 72 hours, depending on, all those factors that we've been talking about all along. Well, it applies to when it starts up too. So that's really important to understand. The more yeast you add in the beginning is not necessarily great to overdo, because here's what can happen. If you add just the right amount of yeast, which is pretty much half packet for like a gallon or 2 gallons or 3 gallons, if you add that right amount, they're going to immediately start using the oxygen that's present and build a colony. And then they create an area where there's no oxygen so that they can start producing alcohol and CO2 in a non-oxygen environment. If you add too much yeast, and this is my theory, if you add too much yeast, then they are now starting to actually produce alcohol and CO2 with oxygen still present. Now, some of them might be off trying to multiply and create a colony, but I have seen it where it starts bubbling almost immediately, and I don't think that that's the best thing to happen. I think having the right amount is the better way to go, and that's why we switched back to using a half packet. We just don't go into 20 minutes of detail every single time we add yeast as to why. So that's kind of an important thing to know.
All right. I think that's
I don't know. I could talk about that for another hour or
I
two.
think we're going to do another podcast on the life cycle of yeast, because I think we could really talk a lot about that.
There's a lot. Yeah.
And
we probably have to do some research.
There's a lot of things that we just never mention.
Yeah. Take for granted. Yeah.
Right. But I think it might be interesting to learn more and share more.
We start doing one podcast and end up with ideas for a new one, just like that.
So we're going to save that for later and move on to yeast nutrition.
Okay. We just did a test on yeast nutrition, and here's what we found. Now, the caveat to this test is, under the circumstances of our test, which was a mead, in a specific environment, using a specific yeast, using a specific honey at a specific gravity, we found these results. Essentially, it started up about the same as the others. Okay, using yeast nutrition versus none, this is. They started up at about the same time. However, the fermentation process was faster using yeast nutrition. By how much? Over a 12-week test that we did, I want to say it was like maybe at 8 weeks, the nutrition was done, and it took the other one 11 to 12 weeks to finish. So there's a difference. I won't get into the complete results of that, because for that, you'll just have to watch the video. It's linked in the description below. But it was a very interesting test, and it told us a lot about how yeast nutrition works. Now, I want to still put that caveat on there that is one test. It is not the end-all be-all. It does not mean that every single time that's what the result's going to be. But it does help to guide us, and based off of our experiences, other people's experiences, and input that we've had throughout the years of doing this, we're formulating some new ideas on how we want to do things moving forward. And, actually it's a good thing. We're probably going to be keeping things just a little bit simpler around here. Believe it or not, we're going even more simple. That's right. But yeast nutrition can play a part. If you are making a high gravity must, having more yeast nutrition or a better nutrition schedule or the right nutrition can definitely speed up the fermentation time. Using things like diammonium phosphate, which you'll never see us do on the show. Actually, I think we did once, because we had something that stalled so bad that I tried using DAP just to get it going again.
It didn't
work. But using things like that can speed up fermentation. Does that mean it's going to be better? That's debatable. I don't think faster equals better. As I said earlier, the more aggressive the fermentation, the more volatile aromas and flavors are possibly lost. Again, that is all depending on a million factors. So don't just take that as rote, but in general, the more aggressive the fermentation, the faster the fermentation, the more flavor loss could possibly happen. There's no way to actually test that, because you can't know what flavors it would have had if they didn't blow out versus what flavors it has for not blowing out, and trying to control the fermentation that way. I don't even know how I'd formulate a test to do that. I couldn't even, because there'd be too many variables. We couldn't actually test it. You'd have other variables that could be causing that same problem. So, yeah.
To further complicate matters, yeast need different things at different times during different stages of fermentation.
That's very true.
So,
and depending on what the must is, you may have a deficiency in one nutrient and not in another. So there's so many variables involved there, and that can also affect time of fermentation. I don't know if you guys are getting the idea yet, but basically we're saying that a slower fermentation is not a bad thing. Just because it takes longer doesn't make it bad. We get people a lot of times that are being kind of impatient, and I try to slow them down. They're like, well, what can I make that'll be ready in 3 days? You can go to the store and buy wine.
Yeah.
That's about it. You cannot reliably make something that will be good with any amount of alcohol in it that will be finished and safe to consume in just 3 days. There's really not much that you can do. I mean, you can make like a Tapachi or something that's going to have like 2 or 3% alcohol, maybe 4%, but that's kind of a living brew. It's not really finished. So if you're looking to make something that's typical wine strength, 10, 12, 13%, and have it in 3 days, I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to make anything good in 3 days. That'll be that high. It just is not going to work. And that I can say without a caveat, I think. I'm just trying to think of all the different variables that it could be. Nope, I'm going to stand by that. I don't think it can be done.
And that's even including turbo yeast. And turbo yeast, I think
we played with that.
Honestly,
It's crap.
It feels more like a marketing ploy than a legitimate thing.
What it actually is just a high-strength yeast with nutrients added. Like usually there's diammonium phosphate and other yeast nutrients already included in the package. So adding nutrients to that is just kind of like doubling up on nutrients, which isn't necessarily a great thing to do.
Nope.
But that's really all it is just a high-powered yeast with nutrients added. Now, I also want to say something. Yeast add their own flavors to the brew. So you want to use an appropriate yeast. And by that, I mean like a wine yeast or ale yeast or something like that is made for doing what you're doing. Distiller's yeast, which is usually what the turbo yeast is, distillers aren't as concerned about the yeast strain as they are about how much alcohol they're getting from it. So that's the major difference there. That's one thing we learned when we were getting into whiskeys and things like that, is that the distillers aren't as concerned about the yeast as fermenters are.
Right. Because they're looking to just have a base.
Yep.
And the flavors don't come to their product until afterwards.
Well, some of it carries through, but it's not as important.
Right.
As with the fermentation, where you're keeping everything. They're throwing away half to 2/3 of the product, or more sometimes, where we're keeping it all. So it's very important to not have stressed yeast, not have a yeast strain that's really not going to give you the best flavors. It's just going to produce the most alcohol. Not really the best way to go. We actually did a podcast on more alcohol and why it might not be the best way to go after a brew. I don't know. What's the term that I should say there? Best way to approach it.
Yeah.
So that's, just don't go after more alcohol just for the sake of more alcohol. It's not always the way to go.
So everything we've talked about so far is the time frame of the fermentation process. And I think lots of people are focusing on that aspect of homebrewing, is when I first build my must and I add my yeast to when my yeasts are done. That's the time frame they're focusing on. But to have a truly finished, ready to drink product, there's some time that's going to occur after fermentation is done. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, the time frame beyond fermentation.
Yeah, and this is something that we've touched on a few times. We haven't got too detailed in it because I still have some more research to do before I can really speak
definitively.
Yeah, on an intellectual level about it. But the gist is yeast create a mess while they're fermenting. Okay, there's a lot of just chaos going on. After fermentation is over, they kind of clean up after themselves if you let them have some time. Now, that might be days to weeks, could even be a month or two. We're finding and seeing and hearing from a lot of people. Adam Franklin, one of our admins and moderators for our VIP group, is famous for this. He will leave a brew sitting for months after it finishes. Now, I can hear what some of you are already thinking, but doesn't that affect the flavor of the brew? Yes, in a positive way. There's a lot of wines that when they're left on the yeast can add an off flavor, but there's also wines that are called sur lees or something like that, where it means like literally on the lees. These styles are different, but a lot of people are getting the idea that leaving it in the primary fermenter on the lees is actually going to hurt the brew. It does not seem to for a long time. And when I say a long time, I'm talking months before there is a noticeable difference in flavor. But during that time, the yeast are cleaning up after themselves. They're also probably, just in general, you're going to have a clearer brew without having to use clarifiers, which, as we've seen, sparkleoid and bentonite both removed flavors from a brew, so we try to not use those as much. If you just give it more time, it cleans up after itself and it clears up, which means a better brew in the long term, which also means a slower fermentation is probably better. Letting it sit afterwards makes it better all on its own without having to use extra stuff. So you know what your best friend is when it comes to brewing? Time and patience. Just let it go. Think about Frozen. I mean, just let it go. And we're seeing this more and more and more, that the evidence is there. Just let it sit. Don't mess with it. Don't touch it. Don't rack it. Just let it go.
And I can appreciate that this is really frustrating, particularly if you're new to the hobby, because you just want to make something right away and enjoy it and share it with all your friends. And I can appreciate that. I've been there. I've done that. Mm-hmm. So if that's your goal, then stack the deck in your favor.
Make more.
Strive for a lower ABV. Get it in a comfortable temperature range. Make sure that you have fermentables that you're using that's going to be most friendly for the yeast that you've selected, and make sure that they have enough nutrition to get their job done. And that will help speed up the process, but it'll still give you something of quality that you'll be proud to share with your friends. And while you're making that, make another one that's going to be able to take some time.
I was just going to say that.
So that way you'll have both and not be so impatient on the one that's taking its time.
My best advice is this. Start something, like she said. Do all those things right. And when you get the inkling that you want to rack it, you want to do something with it, start a new one.
Yeah.
Now, by the time that one gets to that point, the other one that you started first might actually be ready to be racked. Nothing wrong with doing that. And keep them staggered, and you'll always have something to mess with if that's what you really want to do. And to me, that seems the best way. And we actually started doing that before we made the channel. I would always be messing with stuff, and then I found out that it's not necessarily the best way to go. So we just made a little more, and then made a little more. And that's another reason why I like 1 gallon vessels, because you could just keep making a bunch of them, and you can have 10 or 12 or 15 of them going at once, and nobody's going to freak out because you have so much room taken up with huge fermenters all over the place. I'm not speaking from experience or anything. No, not at all.
no.
I used to have them under my desk. They were in the office.
In
They
the
were in the
closets.
kitchen. They were under the table. They were all in my closet. Yeah, I ruined a pair of shoes that way.
Yeah.
So that's the gist. The moral of the story is a slower fermentation and don't be in a rush to move it and rack it afterwards is probably better. But as far as how long should fermentation take? As long as it
depends.
takes. It takes as long as it takes, depending on all the factors that we talked about. If there is an aspect to this that you'd like us to discuss more, or you had a question about it, please ask in the comments below. And if you have a topic that you'd like to see us tackle as a podcast. But as always, guys, thanks so much for listening and have a great day.
Bye-bye.